vault of lies. The crate gave a single, metallic groan when the archivist levered the lid.
We need to go back over these logs.
Suspicion tightened his hands before the light fell in. He saw fresh grind marks along the inner seam and felt the hinge flex the way a modern file does. Stop, the night guard, voice low and fast. Do not touch anything. The archivist did not stop. He reached inside, thumbed the lacquer line, and said, "This was altered. The word suspicion appears now." It pushed him to pry open an official story that should have been locked in glass. He worked in a museum where objects kept reputations as much as records kept dates. The archivist had spent 3 decades cataloging donor papers and accession numbers. He was known for precise lists, for correcting a misfiled ledger entry even when it cost him hours. Tonight he wore a Victorian dark coat with a high collar, his glasses sliding down his nose, his pocket watch tucked and quiet. He paused only to let the night guard hold the lamp while he exposed a curved, spike-lined interior that did not match the crate's provenance card. "Tell me what you see," said the night guard. "Name it exactly." The archivist tapped the weld line, modern tool marks. Willed seams, fresh lacquer. Not medieval. The guard's shoulders shifted. Curator a seal said 16th century on the manifest. The archivist folded the ledger page into his palm and felt the paper grit under his fingers. His suspicion shifted to doubt as he pictured the donor plaque in the foyer and the pamphlet on the museum shelf. He closed the crate just enough to keep the shards of evidence inside. He carried the shell to his office with the night guard guiding the cart and the lamp making the metal flash like a hidden tooth. In the records room he spread the accession ledger across oak and traced a water dink line where an entry had been rubbed. He called up the procurement emails on the workstation. The curator arrived in a pressed suit and an apologetic face within 10 minutes. "Archivist, what is this?" The curator, voice smooth. "You have a crate where?" "In the vault." "The shell is in there." The archivist set the shell down. "Look at the seam here. The ledger has an erased entry for a shipment last spring." The curator reached and ran a thumb across the smear. He frowned and replaced the ledger carefully. Doubt moved through the room. The curator, perhaps the shipping label misprinted. Museums trade replicas all the time. The archivist read the erased ink like a wound. "It is not a replica. Someone altered this to appear older and more terrible." The curator's fingers went to a phone. "We need to call a conservator." "We cannot call them now." The archivist, his voice sharpened. Suspicion had hardened into a definite demand for proof. The forensic restorer arrived before dawn with a soft kit and measured hands. She worked under a magnifier and called each finding aloud. "This lacquer is synthetic. That rivet work is post-industrial. These scratches are from an angle grinder, not from centuries of rust." She held up a microsample to the light. "There is a hidden riveted seam here. Someone welded and then dressed it to look like long corrosion." The archivist traced the seam with one finger and tried not to breathe loudly. His suspicion slid into anger now, a practical anger that ordered emails, phone calls, and new labels. The curator split his stance between defense and damage control. "We need to keep donations quiet until this is assessed. If word leaks, sponsors will cap contributions." The archivist put the ledger down and looked at him. "You knew the provenance." The curator's jaw tightened. "We thought the story would bring visitors. The label came with the piece." "I signed off." The archivist tapped the ledger page. "Who signed the crate manifest?" The curator named a donor and a shipping house, and the accession number. The curator avoided the question and said instead, "You must let the board handle the messaging. This could collapse exhibitions scheduled for next quarter." Word moved faster than caution. A museum sponsor arrived with 2 board members and a press liaison the next morning. The sponsor's polite voice contained a threat that did not need finishing. "Archivist, we have grant obligations. If this affects attendance, we will have to consider funding priorities." The curator stood between his donor and the shelved shell. "He perhaps call it a modern reproduction for now." The archivist lifted his chin. If we label it a reproduction while it is evidence of forgery, that is obstruction. His words landed like metal on stone. The tension changed when the archivist's assistant produced a bent service log recovered from the crate lining. She pushed the log across the desk and left the room while everyone read. The assistant had smudged ink and a note that named a technician and a date 3 months prior. The entry stated explicitly that the technician had been told to enhance the interior to meet visitor expectations. The sponsor let out a breath and tried to smother a laugh. "This is a note?" he asked. The archivist held the log under the lamp. "It is a confession in a hand that signed out the tools." Anger narrowed to a focused priority. Proof. They took the shell to the conservation lab. The forensic restorer photographed every joint and sampled paint. She called in echoes of court procedures as she described modern alloys present in the interior. The curator argued with the registrar over public messaging, while the sponsor whispered to a board member. The archivist watched faces shift when the word forgery left the restorer's mouth. His suspicion now translated into a duty. Secure evidence, document chain of custody, and prevent removal. The first external event after the discovery came when the curator escorted 2 men into the lab and attempted to take the shell away. They moved quick, hands on the crate, faces set. The archivist stepped between them and the crate. "You cannot remove evidence," he said. "This belongs to the inquiry curator. We have institutional authority to transfer exhibits." The night guard blocked the path and said, "No, you do not." The men pushed. The archivist felt his pulse hard in his neck. He watched the curator's hand reach for the latch. The forensic restorer called, "Record everything, now." A scuffle followed. The sponsor shouted the curator's name, the archivist, the night guard, and the forensic restorer wrestled the crate back from 2 board aids long enough to force the latch and reveal the inner mechanism with a camera flash. The reveal was immediate and irreversible. Photographs captured a modern hinge, electric residue in the varnish, and a welded seam masked with acid wash. The sponsor's face went pale. The board members argued about legal exposure. "Archivist," whispered the registrar later, "we must hand this to an independent registrar. If you do not, the institution will bury it." The archivist placed the logbook and photographs into an evidence folder and sealed it with the registrar in the boardroom. "I will not let them remove it." The registrar nodded and took the folder. The fallout moved in stages. The board convened. The sponsor issued a brief statement defending authority while distancing funding. The curator gave a taut interview that prioritized visitors over provenance. The archivist supplied the registrar with the physical evidence and asked for an independent inquiry. The archivist watched the museum's public relations team draft a release that called the object recently reworked rather than forged. He listened to the registrar insist on accuracy. The archivist felt clarity settle. The museum had traded truth for spectacle. After the formal sessions, the archivist returned to the archive stacks alone. He lit a candle with steady fingers and placed the confession log beside the ledger. He reclassified the accession file to reflect forgery and added cross-references to the registrar's report. His hands worked while the candle threw narrow light on names and dates. He catalogued the file under a new heading and wrote a note instructing the registrar to place an embargo on exhibition use until the inquiry concluded. A mid-chapter twist arrived when an email from the shipping house revealed that a curator at a smaller private museum had sold an altered shell to the sponsor 3 months earlier. The sender attached photographs showing the same weld pattern and a receipt signed by the curator. The archivist read it twice. He read it aloud. "Curator, what is this?" The curator's mouth went dry. I thought it was authentic. "I did not see the work." The archivist watched the curator's hands shake and felt a shift from institutional denial to personal culpability. The curator claimed ignorance. The evidence suggested collusion. Arguments followed in the boardroom. The sponsor You brought in revenue with that show. We expect results, the archivist replied. You expected spectacle over truth. The ledger shows an erased entry. The assistant produced a confession. The restorer has material proof. Curator snapped. Archivist, you will ruin programs. Archivist replied, you already ruined the program with a lie. There were 6 back. And 4th lines raw and fast. Names repeated to anchor each speaker. Curator, archivist, sponsor, registrar. The registrar cut in with procedure, and the board voted for an inquiry. The curator left the room with his face set and his hands empty. The archivist did not celebrate. He felt a cold steadiness instead. He refiled the evidence, updated accession records, and wrote a short note to the registrar requesting a full audit of recent acquisitions. He set aside the shipping receipts and circled the technician's handwriting in the service log. The emotion shifted from anger to determination. He moved from confrontation to methodical remediation. Late that night, he sat under a single lamp and arranged the photographs in a row. He read the technician's entry aloud to hear the cadence of the confession. The handwriting named the tools used and the person who supervised. Each sentence required verification. He phoned the forensic restorer. Can you compare the weld marks to that private museum sample? Yes, she said. I will come tomorrow with a comparative microscope. The archivist put the phone down and closed his eyes for one breath. He did not permit sentiment. His movements were precise. In the final act of the chapter, the archivist moved to secure the artifact for the independent registrar. He walked to the vault with the night guard and the assistant. The curator tried to intervene again, hands raised. The archivist, curator, do not touch the crate. The curator answered, archivist, the board asked me to oversee transfer. The archivist checked the registrar's directive and said, this transfer is under registrar custody. Step back. The curator stepped back, jaw tight. The night guard handed the crate to the registrar team. The shell was lifted, photographed, and sealed. The archivist watched the registrar sign the chain of custody and felt the chapter's immediate conflict resolve. He filed the confession and the ledger side by side and relabeled the object. He made a deliberate choice to document, not to shout. He left one final note inside the refiled accession. Do not display without full provenance verification. He struck his pocket watch closed and blew out the candle. The archives swallowed the light, and the registrar's team rolled the crate toward the lift. The archivist heard the metal wheels on stone, and, for the first time since he had started the night, allowed himself a short, controlled exhale. The chapter ends with the registrar's knock on the vault door and the crate crossing threshold into custody. Confronting the construct, the cover lifted and a single collective gasp broke the room. The archivist's suspicion tightened his fingers on the edge of the crate as the reconstructed shell came into view. He had felt that same suspicion 2 nights earlier when the storage crate gave a metallic groan under his pry bar. The hinge had flexed wrong and fresh grind marks had glinted beneath the dust. He knew one during the unveiling. He did not need to speak. His jaw set, and he watched the room argue with itself in a chorus of camera shutters and impressed murmurs. He stood at the back of the gallery. He kept his hands behind his ledger. The crowd clustered near the podium around curator Elise Bauer. Elise smiled and gestured, and conservator Matthias Korf bowed with a practiced, tired relief. A news anchor leaned forward and asked questions into a microphone. The archivist moved his head an inch left and saw a seam that did not belong. He saw a row of rivets that matched 20th century tooling and a grinding pattern along an internal edge that cut clean, sharp, and modern. His suspicion shifted to anger. The room applauded. The archivist counted the welds with his eyes. He had come to the museum expecting to catalogue, not to accuse. He had catalogued for 36 years. He remembered the crate's grown with precise detail. The splinter of smell when the lid cracked open, the thin ribbon of metal dust that floated like a grey flake across the lamp, the way Jacob the night guard hissed. Do not touch anything. that memory stayed with him as a measured, concrete anchor. It returned now as he watched Elise deliver a narrative about public education and the artifact's supposed provenance. He felt the shift. Suspicion became method. He would not speak until he had evidence. He moved through the room like a man with a list. Elise stepped down from the podium. She walked past the archivist. He followed her quietly until she ducked behind a display and onto the staff corridor. He intercepted her in the prep room. The corridor smelled of wax and old paper. A broom leaned against a crate. He closed the door behind them. "Elise," he said, "those seams are modern. Who authorized the welding?" Elise's smile thinned. "Archivist, we agreed. This reconstruction will draw visitors. It is harmless context, harmless." He tapped the inner seam with one finger. "Matthias didn't need to grind the interior like this unless someone asked him to dress it." Elise's throat moved. "We commissioned a faithful interior. Matthias oversaw the work. The public wants a show. Show for what?" His voice dropped. "To make a piece of history a prop." Elise shifted her weight. She kept her voice low. The director wanted attendance numbers. "Matthias will explain." Elise left the word as a fact and walked to the adjacent room. The archivist heard muffled footsteps in the prep area. He found Matthias leaning over an open toolbox, hands black with machine oil. Matthias did not startle. He wiped his palms on his trouser leg. "Matthias, the archivist, why did you file the inner seam?" Matthias straightened. "I was asked to make the interior appear complete. I followed orders." "Who?" Matthias looked toward the prep door. He swallowed. "Curator Elise. The board. The display needed drama." The archivist's suspicion shifted into a pointed, hot indignation he could not hide. He stepped closer and pointed at the seam. "Those marks are not conservation. Those are fabrication marks. You welded a plate inside." Matthias' hands trembled. "I told them it would mislead visitors. The image mattered more. They promised labels would explain the reconstruction. Labels do not justify lies." The archivist. He felt his pulse at the base of his throat. He reached for the camera on his belt to take a photograph but thought better of it. He would not create a scene. Instead he wrote a single sentence into his ledger: "Suspect modern fabrication. Inspect with lab." He turned the page slowly as if closing a case file. He took the shell to the conservation lab that night. The lab technician, Anna Ramos, watched him wheel the object under the examination lamp. Anna's hands were steady. The lab smelled of solvent and warm metal. She slid the shell onto the X-ray table and keyed the console. The room filled with the soft hum of machines. He set the ledger open beside a pair of wire-frame glasses and watched the screen bloom with a ghosted interior. The X-ray revealed a plate welded along the spine with rivet patterns inconsistent with medieval smithing. Anna pointed at a bright line on the monitor. "These rivets are machine-pressed. The steel alloy reads like 19th to 20th century carbon levels." The archivist read the numbers aloud. "Not medieval. Not even early industrial." Anna leaned forward. "This was staged. Whoever did it understood our audience. They wanted spikes and a closed shell that read as weaponized." He felt the second emotional shift. His anger thinned into a cold, precise fear that the museum had engineered horror and sold it as fact. Fear showed in his hands. He tapped 2 fingers on the ledger. "Anna, make copies of these scans. Lock the originals on your workstation." Anna nodded. She moved with deliberate speed, saving files, making 2 encrypted copies, and slipping one onto a small solid-state drive. Her lips compressed when she handed the drive to him. "Anna, if this goes public without context, we'll feed a new myth." They planned to present the findings to the curator quietly the next night. But the museum's schedule shifted. Historian Havel requested a lecture in the small auditorium. The director invited press. Havel arrived and took the stage with a public, forceful defense of the Iron Maiden legend. The crowd about eyewitness lore and the terrible reputation the device carried in pamphlets and town records. Elise sat beside him and smiled. The crowd responded with a ripple of approval. The archivist watched Havel's performance. He felt a simmering irritation as Havel tied folklore to display. Havel's voice was academic and theatrical in equal measure. The legend occupies the gap where documentation is thin. Havel, we must show the popular belief for education. The archivist stood up and interrupted. He walked to the front and placed his hand on the lectern. He did not raise his voice. Havel, he said, you speak of gaps. There is a modern plate inside that shell. You are framing fabrication as education. Havel's brow tightened. Archivist, do not make an accusation in public without evidence. I have evidence. The archivist. Anna has X. Raise. Matthias admitted to modifications. Havel folded his hands. You cannot wreck an exhibit on insinuation. Let the board answer. Elise leaned toward the director and mouthed something. The director's face went blank. The press leaned in like hungry birds. The archivist felt a pressure against his ribs. The room split between those who wanted spectacle and those who wanted exactness. That division became a political tool. Elise then rose and offered to move the exhibit into research review for further study. The crowd accepted the phrase as a delay. The archivist did not accept delay. He arranged a midnight inspection of the storage vault. Jacob, the night guard, met him at the service elevator with a bulky flashlight and a set of keys. Jacob's palms were rough from decades of metal doors. He had stood watch in the museum for years and respected the archivist's process. Jacob, the archivist, you heard do not touch anything in the crate before. I need you to open the storage. Jacob clicked his tongue. We are risking a reprimand. We are risking a lie staying unchallenged. The archivist. Jacob swallowed. Fine. But be quick. They moved through corridors that smelled of stored timber and cold stone. The vault door resisted the flashlight beam with a low, metallic groan. The archivist fitted his wedge under the lid and levered. The crate spat a thin cloud of dust. The same fresh grind marks glittered under the lamp the way he remembered. A crisp line where old iron met new welding. He ran his gloved finger along the seam and felt tiny burrs that should not be there on an authentic medieval surface. Matthias stood at the rear of the vault, hands folded, face pale. He avoided the archivist's eyes. I told them it would fool people, he said. I did what they asked. The archivist lifted the shell and turned it. He found a hidden modern plate, welded from inside and bolted in places that did not belong. The welds were recent. The heat marks still showed a faint blue halo under the rust. The archivist photographed the halo with a small camera and then set the images to the ledger page already open. He confronted Director Greta Lang in that vault before anyone else. Greta arrived breathless, flanked by a security officer whose radio crackled. The light from Greta's phone threw a clinical rectangle across her face. Greta, the archivist, show me the authorization for this reconstruction. Greta's lips pressed together. Archivist, you will disturb donors. We promised a spectacular exhibit. The board signed off on aesthetic changes. The board signed off on labels, not on welded falsifications. The archivist. He kept his tone measured. Matthias, he was pressured. He was told to dress the interior. Greta's expression changed. Her hand moved toward the security officer. Security, take the drive and delete any files you find. This is internal. Jacob stepped between Greta and the archivist. We are not deleting evidence. The security officer closed his hand on Greta's sleeve. Director. We can escort the archivist out. Greta's voice rose. Archivist, you will not force a public scandal tonight. The museum will issue a controlled statement. The archivist felt his pulse thrum. His anger collapsed into narrow, pragmatic clarity. He set the small drive on the concrete floor and pushed it toward Greta. You may offer a statement. You may offer hush money, or you may let the truth move through scholars. I will not delete what I have documented. Greta crouched and picked up the drive. She stared at its metal case. You will hand over your ledger. You will delete your notes. We can manage this. Matthias stepped forward and shook his head. No, I will not lie again. I signed. I cut the plate. I welded edges. Elise me to do it. The board told Elise to do it. Greta's jaw tightened. You promised confidentiality when you took the commission. Matthias laughed. A thin, strained sound. Greta. Promise does not turn a forged piece into history. Words became a collision. The security officer moved toward the archivist. He reached for the drive. The archivist's hand went into his coat and found Anna's second encrypted copy. He slid it into his pocket. Jacob saw the movement and closed a palm over the archivist's shoulder to steady him. The tension snapped into a short, rapid exchange. Jacob, hold him back. Greta, security, take the drive. Security, step away. The archivist, Greta. You will not destroy this evidence. Archivist, you will not make a spectacle. Greta started. Greta, Matthias confessed. Matthias, Elise commissioned the dramatization. Elise says she only wanted visitors. Elise from the crate entrance. I did not mean harm. Greta looked at Elise. Elise, you will stand by me on this. Elise's hands trembled. Greta, we can fix the labels. We can add disclaimers. The archivist stepped between them and flattened his palm against the welded seam. He felt the cool metal under his glove and the tiny burrs beneath his glove's fabric. He spoke slow. Greta, sign this. A public review with independent scholars. No deletion, no hush settlement. Or I will take these files to the university and to the press. Greta's face hardened. Her hand went to her pocket and produced a folded envelope. She slid it across the crate toward the archivist. Greta, Jacob, you cannot buy silence with cash. Jacob's voice felt like gravel, not from him. He works with facts. Greta's eyes did not move from the archivist. Archivist, what do you want? The archivist named a set of concrete demands. Independent metallurgical experts to test the alloy. A public audit of acquisition records. A formal apology to any donor missiled. The museum to postpone the exhibit until the review finished. He did not ask for the director's resignation. He for procedure. Greta hesitated. She glanced at the security officer, then at Elise. The security officer approached and took the drive from his breast pocket. The archivist felt the drive lift and slide away like a small secret. He reacted by placing his ledger on the crate and sliding the X-ray printouts under its weight. The security officer's hand hovered over the ledger. Anna pushed past the security officer and extended her arm. Those scans are part of the lab records, she said. They cannot be removed without a chain of custody. The security officer paused. His radio buzzed. Director, there's movement in the lobby. The press is asking for a statement. Greta made a choice that changed the room. She closed her hand around the envelope and then let it fall into her open palm, unopened. She looked at the archivist and then at the drive. We will convene a review in 2 days with independent parties, she said. You must allow the museum to prepare. Matthias breathed a sound that was part relief and part fear. Greta, will you sign a statement acknowledging the modifications? Greta's face tightened. I will not make admissions I cannot substantiate. The archivist felt the situation tilt. He could force a scandal tonight, but it might become a rumor without the forensic chain of custody. He chose a different action. He closed his ledger, slid the X-ray printouts into an evidence envelope, and handed a copy to Anna. Anna, send encrypted copies to the independent lab at the university. Do not use museum servers. Anna's hand trembled as she accepted the envelope. I will do that, she said. Elise stepped forward. Archivist, if we postpone, can you work with us on proper labeling and on an honest narrative? His anger returned briefly, harder and raw. Then it eased into method again. Elise, if the museum wishes to present reconstruction, it must be clearly labeled and accompanied by all available documentation. That is not opinion, that is duty. Greta's security officer moved to close the vault door. He kept one hand on the latch and looked to Greta for final instruction. The director touched the envelope in her hand and then tucked it into her coat. She stepped toward the elevator. Outside the vault, in the corridor at dawn, the archivist sat at a small metal table and opened his ledger. He wrote a methodical entry, the times, the names, the welded plate, the X-ray results, who had been present, and what they said. His handwriting was small, precise, and deliberate. He folded the ledger page and sealed it in an envelope. Anna placed the encrypted drive beside it. "Send these to Hildesheim University and to Professor Brandt. Do not post them anywhere yet," he instructed. Anna nodded. "I will send them tonight by courier." Jacob stood by the door, rubbing his palms together. "Archivist, what happens now?" The archivist closed his eyes for 2 measured breaths. He had moved through suspicion, anger, fear, and back to a stubborn clarity that felt like purpose. "Now," he said, "we make certain the evidence moves beyond the museum's control. We ensure independent review. We give the public truth with sources." Anna pushed the drive into her pocket and checked the ledger seal. "Archivist, do you fear retaliation?" He opened his eyes and looked at the lab lights reflecting off her glasses. He described physical reactions rather than abstract dread. "My hands shook during the confrontation. My mouth tasted of metal. I slept 3 hours. But fear cannot be an argument against truth." Jacob laughed softly. "You always write like that." Precise and stubborn, Matthias appeared in the corridor doorway with a thin paper cup of coffee. He held it out to the archivist. "Archivist, I am sorry," he said. "I did it for money and familiarity. I did not think where it would lead." The archivist accepted the cup. He drank and felt the coffee cut the metallic hollow in his mouth. "Matthias," he said, "you will give a written statement. Name everyone who ordered the work. Sign it under oath." Matthias's shoulders dropped. "I will." The archivist felt a small, procedural closure. The immediate crisis in the vault had been resolved. Greta had agreed to a delayed review. Matthias had confessed. Anna had secured copies, and the archivist had preserved the chain of custody. Yet the larger conflict, the museum's trade in manufactured horror, remained. He recorded the commitments and the uncertainties in precise sentences. Each line in the ledger read like a command packet for later action. Before dawn fully broke, he placed the sealed envelope and the second encrypted drive in a secure courier bag reserved for rare transfers. He wrote the courier's number and signed the manifest with his name. He slid the bag into a metal locker and locked it with a key he kept on a separate ring. He did not celebrate. He closed the locker and left the key under a tile in the staff room where only he and Jacob would think to look. He walked out into the grey morning and felt the day enter as an ordinary set of tasks. Inventory, cross-references, phone calls. He moved with the same steady gait he used to navigate stacks of brittle paper. He had moved the evidence from suspicion into a process that could not be easily erased. He had forced a choice on the museum that would require witnesses and signatures. At 8:15, Anna confirmed she had transmitted an encrypted packet to the independent lab and that Professor Brandt had acknowledged receipt. Jacob signed a watch log noting the vault inspection. Matthias gave his written confession to the registrar and included the names he had been ordered to protect. The archivist recorded each step in his ledger in tight, exact script. When he closed the ledger at 9:30, he did not write a reflection about fate or destiny. He wrote a single concrete line: "Evidence secured, independent review requested, museum response pending." He sealed the ledger and placed it under the lock with the courier bag. He stepped outside the museum into a clean, public morning. Newspaper vans idled on the curb. The director would put out a statement later. The press would prowl for rumor. The archivist kept his face still. He had produced a chain of custody and 3 witness statements that would force the museum to answer under scrutiny rather than spin a story. He had converted suspicion into documented proof. As he walked away, he felt an aftertaste of unease, tightness in his jaw, and the memory of someone reaching for the drive. But that unease was rooted in a physical fact, not a metaphor. He kept his hands in his coat pockets and tightened his grip on Anna's encrypted copy. He thought of the crate's groan and the thin ribbon of metal dust that had first told him something was wrong. He had followed that sound to a room where choices were being made for visitors' stomachs rather than for historical truth. The morning swallowed the museum's doors and left the sealed locker humming under the fluorescent light. The archivist walked toward his office with the ledger against his chest. He intended to draft a formal submission to the university, to the press, and to the professional body for conservators. He had forced the museum into a corner where it had to either open its books or concede fabrication. He had resolved the chapter's immediate conflict. The welds would not vanish tonight. The rest would require endurance, records, and public scrutiny. He unlocked his office, set the ledger on his desk, and turned the key once more to confirm that the locked courier bag and sealed ledger remained in the evidence locker. He placed a final post-it on the ledger with one instruction: dispatch to Brant on receipt confirmation. He tucked his thin wire frame reading glasses into his breast pocket, took a breath, and stepped toward the phone to make the first of several calls. The day had begun. The evidence was in motion. Final reckoning, truth unsealed. The museum director slammed his palm on the oak desk and said, "Tell the board the Iron Maiden is medieval, or you will lose everything." The archivist's fingers tightened around the ledger at his belt. Suspicion sat in the back of his throat like metal. The director stepped forward, voice low and blunt. "You heard me, Harris. Keep the myth." "We open in 2 weeks," the archivist, whose hands had pried open a crate that groaned, and whose eyes had tracked fresh grind marks along a seam, stood and did not answer right away. Harris, the archivist narrator, moved a worn leather ledger onto the desk with both palms. He kept his face still. His mouth tasted of candle smoke. Within 5 sentences, the problem was visible. The museum planned a public exhibition built on a lie, and the archivist had the documents that would undo it. He had felt suspicion for nights. He had felt it when the crate gave a metallic groan, and that suspicion now demanded a sequence of choices rather than silence. "Harris," the director, naming him, "you are the senior archivist. We need the headline. You can either be the one who writes it or the one who ruins it." The director's jaw clenched. He tapped the ledger with a thumb. "You will be rewarded for compliance." The reward was followed by a shorter sentence: "Or you will be blamed for our failure." The archivist heard the threat as action. The room smelled of old paper and boiled coffee. The archivist set the ledger down and looked at the director. "Show me the provenance again, Harris." His voice was even. He had not yet let fear arrive. He wanted facts in front of him before emotions moved his wrists. "Show me the receipts." The director's face hardened. "Not now. Later, in private." For the opening night speech, the director reached for the ledger and his fingers hovered over the page as if the object itself could be co-opted. Outside the office door, the corridor light clicked off and the night guard's footsteps slowed. The archivist saw the guard's silhouette through the frosted glass and felt the first emotion shift, suspicion becoming unease. He remembered the crate's hinge flexing the way a modern file does. That memory cut his patience into a decision. "No, we address the board now. The ledger belongs to the collection record." The director's face went pale for a heartbeat, and then red with anger. They argued with short, hard sentences. "We open on schedule." The director: "We bring tickets." "We do not delay. You will present false history," Harris replied. "I will not be party to it." The director barked. "Harris, think of funding. Think of donors." Harris answered, "Think of truth. Think of the people who come here and trust us." The director's voice dropped. "Trust is a luxury museums can no longer afford," he said. The second external event arrived as the clock hands crossed 11. The forensic conservator, Marta Klein, appeared in the doorway with a white folder clamped to her chest. She had been at the laboratory all night. Marta's shoes made a soft thud on the worn carpet. "I have the tests," she said. She placed the folder on the desk and pushed 2 sheets toward Harris. Her voice did not ask permission. Harris skimmed the pages. The lab had recorded microscopic striations on the inner seam. There were alloy readings, elevated manganese, a casting pattern consistent with 19th century bloomery techniques, and modern rivet marks. Marta tapped a printed close-up photograph with a gloved finger. Harris' eyes traveled over the image, where a straight file mark crossed the seam at an angle inconsistent with medieval blacksmithing. The second emotion shift moved from unease into sharp fear, not of bodily harm but of institutional collapse. He realized the director's insistence was no longer merely a reputational gamble. It was an active choice to deceive the public. Marta, the manganese level. Harris, 19th century alloy. Marta, the interior shows machine-driven abrasion. The hinge is a later repair. This is a construction consistent with a theatrical prop. Marta's words were clinical. The director tried to interrupt. Those tests are preliminary. Marta looked at him and did not soften. These are catalog, quality analysis, Thomas. They contradict your statement to donors. The director's jaw tightened. Thomas Vale, the museum director, lowered himself into the chair opposite the archivist. He spoke in a flat voice. Harris, you leave me no choice. You can either stay and help me manage the fallout, or you walk out and burn 2 decades of work. Harris remembered the crate giving a single metallic groan, and the night guard telling him, do not touch anything, in a fast, low voice. The memory lingered as a pathway he had to follow. Marta, Harris, make copies for the board. Print everything. I will not alter facts. Marta nodded and opened the folder again to run copies. That moment turned the private confrontation into a documented conflict. The archivist felt the third emotional movement. Clarity. Clarity came when records, not rhetoric, guided decisions. He chose to move forward, to make the evidence public rather than let the museum mend its narrative in the dark. He took the ledger, and said, we call a board meeting at dawn. The director's posture changed. A threat that had been implied hardened into a direct counter. Threat, if you bring this to the board on your own, Harris, you will be cancelled. We have donors who will remove funds. We have a press release prepared. Think about your reputation. The director's threat was precise. Harris felt his pulse under his collarbone. He set the ledger on his shoulder, gripped it as if it were a weight that proved truth rather than a burden of consequence. Then let them decide, he said. The forensic conservator and the archivist retreated to the conservation laboratory. Marta began the formal transfer of test data to a portable drive. She worked with deliberate, efficient motions. The lab smelled of solvents and warm metal. They photographed micrographs and packaged samples for chain of custody. The night guard, Raymond, who had been present during the original crate opening, returned with a small brown envelope. Harris, I found this under the floor slat where the crate sat. Raymond. He pushed the envelope across the bench. Delivery receipts. Addressed to Spectacle Props, Brockton. Raymond folded his hands and watched their faces. Harris opened the envelope and slid out a set of brittle receipts stamped with a 19th century postal mark and a typed invoice. The invoice listed a spike, lined shell, theatrical, and a delivery date in 1879. The archivist read the address aloud. Spectacle Props, Brockton. Paid in full. Receipt signed E. Mallory. Marta looked up. That closest provenance immediately, she said. Her voice had the stripped quality of someone who had finished lab work and did not want to dramatize. The director's offer and threat returned in a new form. He texted a donor during the night. The donor's message, later recovered, asked bluntly why the museum had not found earlier provenance. The donor pushed for silence to avoid scandal. Thomas Vale believed he could control the narrative because he had staged narratives before. Harris and Marta had constructed a different narrative with metal analysis and paper receipts. Raymond's ledger and the receipts formed a binding chain. The emotional arc tightened, from suspicion to unease to fear, then clarity, then a surge of righteous resolve. At midnight, when the archivist tried to make copies of the receipts, the director lunged. He moved too fast. His fingers closed on paper, and Harris stepped in to pull the ledger back. Thomas shoved, and a scuffle followed. The reconstructed shell, still on its pallet in the storage room, tipped. The metal hole struck the concrete floor with a heavy, scraping impact. Sparks flew on the seam where modern repairs had been made. The shell did not open, but its tipping sent a cascade of straw and dust across the floor. "Stop!" Raymond shouted, grabbing Thomas' arm. "Stop it, Thomas!" The director cursed, and Harris lowered himself to steady the ledger and the receipts he clutched. The scuffle lasted 8 seconds. It left Harris' knuckles scraped and Thomas's cuff torn. Marta stood against the shelf and inhaled through her teeth with a sound that was almost a laugh. The scuffle forced an immediate external decision. The archivist called the chair of the board at dawn and asked for an emergency meeting. He emailed the journalist he had previously met in the reading room and included the lab data and a scanned copy of the receipts. The journalist replied with a short line. "On my way." That reply arrived at 3:17 a.m. The archivist laid the ledger on the table and watched the small glowing number on the phone as if it were the hinge of a truth. Dawn arrived pale and hard. The boardroom smelled of disposable coffee and recycled air. The director stood at the head of the table and said, "We were close to a major public success. Why sabotage it now?" The archivist did not answer. He placed the ledger, the receipts, and Marta's printed laboratory pages on the table and opened them so every board member could see the photo of the seam and the typed invoice. Board members murmured. One leaned forward and said, "This invoice, who signed it?" Harris answered, "E. Mallory. Spectacle props. Delivery 1879. The director tried to interject, but the forensic conservator held up a micrograph and said, "The file marks cross the seam in a way inconsistent with hand forging. The manganese ratio corresponds to 19th century casting." "This is not medieval," a board member named Claire stopped the director mid-argument. "Thomas, these are tests and a ledger. We must review them." The board voted to delay the exhibition and open an inquiry. Thomas's face emptied as the vote passed. A journalist from the regional paper stood behind the glass partition with a recorder held off to the side. "Mr. Vale, what is your response?" The director's answer came in small, brittle sentences. "We will cooperate. We will correct the record if necessary." The journalist's follow-up asked whether donors had been informed. The director's gaze slipped to the floor. Not yet." The archivist heard the director admit, by omission, that there had been intention to conceal. The board's decision moved quickly. They voted to suspend the director pending an independent inquiry. The forensic conservator catalogued evidence for transfer. Raymond, the night guard, gave a sworn statement that described the crate's groan and the director's insistence. The museum entered institutional shock. Donor letters came in the following hours. Some demanded refunds. Others asked for public clarification. The board formed a committee to liaise with legal counsel. The museum's press officer prepared a terse public statement. In the immediate fallout, a surprising twist emerged. Mallory, the name on the invoice, was not a single maker, but a partnership whose records matched a traveling spectacle company that sold theatrical horrors to private collectors in the 19th century. The archivist and Marta found shipping logs tying a Brockton address to a second-hand dealer who advertised in a trade paper catering to curtain and prop specialists. That reveal changed the story's scope. This was not a one-off forgery but part of a 19th century commerce in manufactured monstrosities. The board's inquiry expanded. During the hearing, the director attempted a defense based on institutional pressure and market demand. Other museums have presented reconstructed objects. We meant to contextualize. Harris, contextualize by lying is not curation. Contextualize by evidence is our job. The director pushed back. Do you want the museum to be irrelevant? Do you want it to fail? Harris answered, I want it to keep its duty. If it refuses, then it is not a museum but a theater. The exchange had rapid lines, 3 to 5 short back and forths that revealed character. The director used broad strokes to defend his choices. Harris used precise facts. Several external events occurred every few paragraphs. The director's text to a dunner arrived as evidence. The night guard's ledger was recovered. The lab shipped a subset of samples to an independent analyst. Each event altered the board's calculus. At one point, a board member named Claire demanded to see provenance records for other recent acquisitions. She found gaps and requested a curator's audit. Claire's insistence forced the museum's leadership to confront a pattern rather than a single bad decision. As the inquiry unfolded, public reaction shifted. Visitors publicly voiced confusion. A local historian published a short piece linking 19th century spectacle culture to the museum's now disputed Iron Maiden. The archivist watched camera phones photographing the ledger's brittle page. He felt the final emotional shift, from resolve into a heavy, quiet satisfaction that truth, when assembled piece by piece, could dismantle a manufactured horror. Satisfaction here arrived not as triumph but as the calm after purposeful labor. Raymond, the night guard, who had been steady through the crate opening and the scuffle, provided testimony that made a practical difference. He had written down the crate's arrival time and the courier's name in his nightly log. His handwriting matched a previously overlooked accession slip that bore a 19th century handwriting style. Raymond explained in 2 short sentences how he had found the accession ledger tucked in a crate corner. His action forced the museum's registrar to acknowledge a missing cross check. The independent inquiry recommended the suspension of the director and the commissioning of an external provenance audit for all high-profile objects. Donors were offered transparent accounting and refunds where appropriate. The museum's board pledged to fund a small conservation fellowship dedicated to ethical acquisition. The director resigned before the inquiry completed. His resignation letter used neutral phrases and avoided admission. In the archive vault that night, Harris returned to the workbench with the ledger and the single rusting spike that Marta had recovered inside the shell's interior. He did not stage the spike for symbolism. He placed it where his hands could reach it easily. He ran a fingertip along its pitted surface and found grit caught on an old burr where a modern file had ground a notch. He placed the spike upright into a small gap in the stone slab and steadied it. The action was deliberate and concrete, an archivist setting an item in a secure orientation for cataloging. He wrote a record entry that listed dates, catalog numbers, laboratory results, and a note referencing the Brockton receipt. His handwriting stayed compact and legible. Each entry would be discoverable by a future researcher who could verify chain of custody. He closed the ledger and slid the brass clasp across the leather cover. He put his pocket watch away. He felt the residual adrenaline leave his shoulders and the steadiness return to his hands. The public statement the museum released was factual and short. It read that the institution had paused an exhibition pending a provenance review and invited experts to verify claims. The statement did not dramatize or moralize. It used dates, names, and actions rather than emotional language. The archivist preferred it that way. He had seen how theatrical horror had been manufactured and how easy it was to turn curiosity into cruelty by presenting fiction as fact. One unexpected consequence came when an independent journalist traced the spectacle prop's connection to a traveling show that sold dramatic antiquities to private collectors and exhibition houses. That firm specialized in reproductions designed for shock. The journalist found correspondence showing that some 19th century collectors had willingly embellished origins to raise prices. The story published a month later did not sensationalize the victims. It laid out invoices, letters, and lab reports in side-by-side comparisons. It exposed a market that profited from manufactured suffering. The archivist received an email from a small museum in a neighboring county asking for help auditing a donation. They attached a photograph of a battered chest with a typed invoice. Harris replied with a single line and an offer. Bring the documents. We will look. He felt a low, practical responsibility to apply what he had learned. He did not feel heroic. He felt methodical and necessary. Weeks later, a public panel convened with conservation scientists, legal counsel, and independent historians. Marta presented micrographs and chemical tests. Raymond described accession procedures. Claire, the board member who had insisted on transparency, chaired the session with clear, direct questions. The panel concluded that museums must strengthen provenance checks and avoid the market pressures that turn history into spectacle. It recommended clear acquisition policies and a public registry for contested items. The aftermath reshaped the museum's internal culture. A new acquisitions policy emphasized verifiable paper trails and independent testing for objects that claimed sensational histories. The director's suspension and resignation became a case study in governance failures rather than a personal scandal to be whispered about. The archivist returned to cataloging with the ledger at hand, and he found himself more watchful of incoming crates. Suspicion had not left him, but it had moved into routine vigilance. At the archive bench one evening, Harris unlocked the ledger and turned to the page where he had recorded the board meeting's minutes. He ran his finger down the line that noted the spike he had planted upright in the slab. He closed the ledger carefully. He placed the rusting spike into a labeled evidence bag and slid it into a sealed box along with copies of the receipt and lab printouts. He set the box on a high shelf where it could be reached for a public inquiry. Before leaving the vault, he looked at the shell in storage through the narrow window of the conservation door. The shell sat on its pallet with a blanket draped over it, not displayed, not framed for shock. The archivist breathed in and smelled cold iron and wax. He thought of the crate that groaned the night he first pried its lid and of the night guard's fast voice saying, "Do not touch anything." He walked out and locked the door behind him. Outside, the morning paper lay in a stack on the curator's desk with a headline that read, "Museum pauses exhibit after provenance dispute." The article quoted the board's statement and included a photograph of a ledger page, a micrograph, and the typed invoice. It did not show the rusting spike. Harris sat for a moment and then stood up, pocket watch in hand, and walked to his office to update the accession files. He set the ledger in its place. That night, in the dim vault light, he placed the single rusting spike upright on the stone slab as a practical marker for the case file and closed the ledger. The ledger's clasp clicked. The spike sat steady. The final act was a record kept, a public inquiry opened, and an institution forced to choose truth over spectacle. He left the archive with the ledger and a list of chain of custody entries in his pocket, ready to hand them to investigators if required. The concrete event that closed the chapter was the board's vote to suspend the director and the archivist's placement of the spike into an evidence box, not an elegy or a promise,